Record that. All right. So welcome everybody to Roundabout Books Thursday Night Author Series. We are so excited to be joined by two authors who reside in Portland, Oregon, although Omar is joining us from out of the country technically right now. So that's so cool. So my name is Julia. I'm the events manager at Roundabout. If you haven't been to one of our Zoom or in-person events before, hi, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I just want to remind everybody that Roundabout is going to continue to offer both Zoom and in-person events, and most of our in-person events will continue to have a Zoom option, so that if you are unable or uncomfortable with being in the store during this time, we want to make sure you can still see all of our events. They are also recorded and on our YouTube channel. So next week, we have another Portland author in the store on Thursday night. And then on Friday the 12th, we have two local vegan chefs who have put out a book called Beefless Cakes, and they're going to do a presentation on it and possibly be bringing us some samples of food pre-packaged for social distancing. So please do continue to join us in the store for those events, or catch them via Zoom or YouTube. I'm very excited for this event tonight. I first saw Omar El Akkad at Bookfest in Portland in Omar, remind me, was it 2017 or 2018 when you did the panel with Lydia Yuknovich?
I think it was 2017.
Okay, and we have an age of the day. So let's not think about that. That was 4 years ago. So once I heard that you had a new book coming out, I was very excited to welcome you to our store. So really quick, I'm just going to read a little bit about the book and our two speakers tonight, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. So we are here tonight to talk about Omar's book, What Strange Paradise. Jen Gish, author of The Resistors, Gish Jen, I said that backwards. It is one thing to put a human face on a migrant crisis and another to do so in so compelling a way that a reader simply cannot put your book down. So here's a little bit more about the book. More bodies have washed up on the shores of a small island. Another overfilled, ill-equipped, dilapidated ship has sunk under the weight of its too many passengers, Syrians, Ethiopians, Egyptians, Lebanese, Palestinians, all of them desperate to escape untenable lives back in their homelands. But miraculously, someone has survived the passage. 9-year-old Amir, a Syrian boy who is soon rescued by Vänna. Vänna is a teenage girl who, despite being native to the island, experiences her own sense of homelessness in a place and among people she has come to disdain. And though Vänna and Amir are complete strangers, though they don't speak a common language, Vänna is determined to do whatever it takes to save the boy. Omar El Akkad is an author and journalist. He has reported from Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and many other locations around the world. His work earned Canada's National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism and the Gough Penny Award for Young Journalists. His previous book, American War, is available. It won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award, the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, and the Kobo Emerging Writers Prize. Joining us tonight is Portlander Kate Ristau, who is the author of the middle grade series, Clock Breakers, and the young adult series, Shadow Girl. You can read her essays in the New York Times and the Washington Post. In her ideal world, magic and myth combine to create memorable stories with unforgettable characters. Until she finds that world, she'll live in a house in Oregon where they found a sword behind the water heater and fairies in the backyard. Thank you both so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you, Roundabout, Herringbone, Dudley's, and Paulina Springs for inviting us to speak today. I'm really, really excited to talk with Omar tonight. Omar, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's, I was saying earlier that I got the chance to meet you for the first time actually at the Willamette Writers Conference, but I didn't get a chance to talk with you about your first book, American War. So I think this is going to be a really good opportunity to talk about your writing career as a whole and, a lot of the amazing work that you've done. So some of the audience might not yet be familiar with your new book, What Strange Paradise. So would you be okay with just giving us a little snippet of your first chapter to kind of bring them into the story?
Sure, yeah. So this is literally the first two paragraphs of the first page. The child lies on the shore. All around him is littered with the wreckage of the boat and the wreckage of its passengers. Shards of decking, knapsacks cleaved and gutted, bodies frozen in unnatural contortion. Dispossessed of nightfall's temporary burial, the dead ferment indecency. There's too much of spring in the day, too much light. Face down with his arms outstretched, the child appears from a distance as though playing at flight. And so too in the bodies that surround him, though distended with seawater and hardening, there flicker the remnants of some silent levitation, a severance from the laws of being.
Thank you. There's that heartbreaking language and the story and just the way that you bring us into it with starting with that child. For you, where did this story come from? Like, how did it begin?
The closest thing I have to a sort of genesis moment was in 2012. I was still working as a full-time journalist, and I was in Egypt, which is where I was born. I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and I was driving around town with an old high school friend, and he was complaining about the most universal thing there is, rent. He was saying, rent is too high, rent is too high. And I asked him at one point, I said, okay, what's the rent for an apartment in your building, for example? And he said, well, do you mean the locals' price or do you mean the Syrians' price? And I said, what the hell is the Syrians' price? He said, well, we've had these refugees come in. There's been an influx of them, and you can charge them 3 times as much. I mean, what are they going to do? Go somewhere else? And it became the case that this wasn't just an apartment thing. This was down at like the fruit and vegetable vendor down the street. As soon as they heard your accent and they could tell you weren't from here, they put 2 and 2 together, and same thing would happen. And just the sort of the casualness of that cruelty, like how instantaneous it was that the society would immediately pinpoint and begin to exploit a vulnerable population because it can be done. I don't think that's an Egypt exclusive thing. I think that happens across the board because of the kind of world we've created. So I started thinking about those things, and I started sketching a story that was trying to write against that. And of course, over the course of that time, you would see constantly these images of the migrant shipwrecks across the Mediterranean. And one of the things that struck me about it was, these things would come wrapped in outrage. People would post to social media and say, how can we let this happen? And that would last for about 24 hours. And then we would all move on to the next thing we needed to be outraged about, and the next day, and so on and so forth. And I think part of that was a sort of psychic self-defense mechanism to living through the Trump years, where every day there was a new sort of thing to be outraged about. But I wanted to do the opposite of that. I wanted to dwell. And at one point during the construction of the process, I settled on the idea of taking a comforting fairy tale that Westerners have been telling their kids for the last 100 years and inverting it to tell a different kind of story. So that's how the book is very much the Peter Pan fable, reinterpreted as the story of a child refugee. So all those things kind of came together, and over the course of about 5 years, a few years of thinking about it, a year and a half of research, a year of writing, year and a half of rewriting, it all sort of came together into this novel.
So did you end up kind of pulling those characters from Peter Pan and finding ways to fit them in, or little people that like kind of exemplified some of them?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that unless you're intimately familiar with Peter Pan and the life of J.M. Barrie, the guy who wrote Peter Pan, it doesn't sort of scream, it doesn't come screaming off the page. I mean, to give you a sense, it's things like in the original Peter Pan, they disguise Peter at one point as an Indian. That's how they, and so that scene in the book is Amir and Vanna, the 2 kids. Amir's clothes are soaked. They want to find new clothes. They sneak into the hotel room of these American tourists on the island. She's rummaging around. She finds a Cleveland baseball jersey, throws it on him, and that it's that kind of thing. There's no overt Peter Pan, but there's a lot of Peter Pan under the surface.
And for you readers out there, as I was reading this, the book, I kept finding myself just repeatedly frustrated, and
I have that effect on people, yeah.
I wanted people to be better. I wanted like things to be different. Like I wanted things to change. Like and there's this the main character Amir, basically there's two stories that go alongside each other, and the one story is the before and the other story is the after. How did you create that structure? Like, how did that start to happen?
Yeah, about 4 drafts in was when so the book went through 8 drafts from sort of first to the one that's on bookshelves. And about halfway through, I realized that I was going back and forth between how this boy ended up on the island and what was happening once he did land on that island. But I was doing it mid-chapter, and I was there was a lot of contrived. I mean, everything's contrived. It's a made-up novel, but like the back and forth was very jarring because I was doing it mid-chapter. And at one point, I thought, well, why don't I just keep going back and forth? And one of the things that did, the book steals from a lot of places. It obviously steals from Peter Pan, also an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is the other epigraph. And if you know that story, you have a sense of what you're in for. The Odyssey, the Book of Nicodemus, but it steals a lot from it has a very sort of biblical Old Testament, New Testament going back and forth. We go from a miraculous rebirth to an exodus from Egypt, and we're going back and forth. And those two things seem to land right on top of each other. This kind of weird biblical thing I was doing with this, and also the before and after. And once I made that overt, it was one of the very few times where I've made a big structural decision and it worked out for me. Usually these things turn into like a huge garbage fire and I have to delete stuff. It actually happened with this novel. At one point I had monologues from each of the people on the ship that's sailing across, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And about 2 drafts in, I realized it wasn't working at all. So that was 30,000 words. It had to go. But this worked once I got into that before after thing. It also allowed me to do a couple of things narrative wise, in terms of telling you something way up front and it doesn't become clear what the hell I'm talking about until it allowed me to do that a little more easily. So once that came into place, I was much happier.
Yeah, because the before scenes, like we know that the child's going to end up on the beach on gonna come, the ship is gonna get wrecked, and so you have that in each of those before scenes. It's just kind of looming over your head that all of these things that are happening are not gonna end up well, right? But then in the after, there is this sense of hope that kind of comes from this character Vanna, because she is trying to be courageous in like the middle of all these terrible things that like kind of keep happening. And it's something I saw in your American War book too, where like bureaucracy and like just the little things that like just dig and dig and dig and dig and how did you kind of find yourself building those into your book, like, and is that something that you normally talk about in terms of like bureaucracy and dehumanization and
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spent 10 years as a journalist, and I was all over the place. I did foreign reporting. I was a business reporter for a while. My last few years, I was a US correspondent, but I was a US correspondent for a Canadian newspaper. So I was covering this country for people who don't live here, which is a very strange thing to do because, like, for example, you have to have on any story on healthcare that you're telling Canadians about America, you always have to have these paragraphs that basically say like, no, this is how it works down here. Same thing with gun control or something like that, because a lot of folks in Canada, it may as well be sort of outer space. It's an entirely different way of thinking about things. But one of the recurring themes was that you constantly had to deal with bureaucracy. You'd file freedom of information requests and you'd get things where the entire sheet is blacked out except the words the or and or what, and that somebody sat down and did this, and you wonder how it is that they go to bed at night. Like, how do you're such a gear and like a horrible machine. So a lot of my villains, my individual villains have a conscience. They're horrible people, but they don't lie to themselves. The systems are purely fraudulent. They work on lies. And one of the real problems you have, or at least I have when I write these kinds of books, is that, I think of fiction as having an obligation to intrude on reality. And instead it's reality that's intruding on the fictional. There's a scene in What Strange Paradise where they're watching TV in Egypt, and this general with the military is giving a press conference where he's explaining that the glorious Egyptian military has just discovered a device that cures all diseases. and people are clapping, and that really happened. I saw that press conference. But you put it in the book, and it sounds more fictional than anything else that's happening in the book. And so trying to pin down the thing that I'm tilting towards for the rest of my writing career, trying to get at that, because it's infuriating to me.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember listening to the audiobook of American War, and at one point in the story, it's one of the, ephemera from the journalism where it just goes redacted, 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 and it's almost an entire chapter of listening to just somebody saying redacted, redacted, redacted. And I think it was an even more jarring experience listening to it on audiobook, because I think you see that page and you're like, yeah, they redacted some stuff. But if you're actually like sitting there and listening to somebody saying redacted, 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 like,
Yeah, I mean, that came out of Guantanamo Bay, the time I spent covering it there, because that was the quintessential military bureaucracy. I remember at one point they would give us the court documents after every trial. And then the court system in Guantanamo Bay was made up on the fly. It's just an ad hoc system they designed to get convictions. Ironically, they've hardly ever managed to get any convictions. But one of the things they would do is they give us the court documents and they would black them out that way, right? So they would redact things. And at one point they gave us one where they had a little appendix. It was a defense motion, and it had an appendix at the end that was blacked out. You'd get certain paragraphs where it was just the or and or whatever. But the appendix was a copy of a New York Times article that the defense lawyer had just added to make it easier for the judge to sort of, because they'd referenced it earlier in the motion. So immediately all the journalists get up, we go to our computers, we load up the New York Times, and we just bring up this article, and you can immediately see what it is the military has decided was too dangerous for you. And I thought, at no point in this process did anybody down the chain of command say, what are we doing? Why are we redacting a publicly available article on the most popular news site on the world? Like, what is, and I think that's what being part of a system like that does to people, is that you ignore the futility or the sort of natural irrationality of what you're doing. So we had redacted New York Times articles.
redacted, redacted. Yeah, we had that was especially sticking with me as I was reading What Strange Paradise too. And another one of those little interruptions of the real world that makes the real world seem surreal. It was halfway through the book. I won't ruin anything for anyone who hasn't read, but the colonel who you're talking about is standing in the room watching, and the TV's on, and there's two people arguing back and forth, and one says, "We're talking about children," the interviewer says. "Just recently we saw the now infamous images of a child in one of the immigrant facilities. That was last year. That was last month. Do you honestly think the state has no special obligations to that child?" "It is not the responsibility of the state," the politician replies. "It is the responsibility of its parents who chose to bring it on this kind of journey." So this kind of taking this one child's experience and trying to blast it out and make it make sense in terms of the larger bureaucracy, the larger world, the refugee crisis. And I kind of like stick on that word because I'm like, as much as like your book was dealing with the refugee crisis, it was dealing with like the refugee experience and like this individual child's experience.
Yeah, I mean, that scene that comes from a line I heard. It was a Greek politician who was talking about a child and kept referring to the child as it, like would not refer, like needed that sort of dehumanization in order to be able to hold the position that they held. And so there was that one, and then there's another line in the book where one of the politicians is asking, if these women in these camps are so destitute and their husbands are all dead, why do they keep asking for birth control? That's a real line. That was another Greek politician who is this notion that once you fall into this category, in my mind, the act of you just being alive is all you can ever hope for. Anything above that is a luxury, is hedonism. How dare they ask for cell phones, this thing that we all use and rely on all of the time. And so those two were things I stole from actual politicians. And again, you have that same problem of like, it seems fictional. It seems like an almost fictional level of cruelty, as does the whole setup of this idea of Europe's migrant crisis. No, it's a few people on boats. And if one of the richest societies in human history is so fragile, it's going to fall apart because some of the most destitute human beings on earth are looking for shelter there's something structurally wrong with that society to begin with. And so I was trying to get at that. notion of the privilege of what constitutes a crisis in your life. Because for the folks showing up, a crisis is when your home gets bombed and you have nowhere to live, and if you stay, you'll be murdered. And then on the other side, the crisis is that some people might show up and they might sort of weigh down our social safety net or whatever it is that the nightmare is. That's a very asymmetric definition of crisis.
Mm-hmm. And you see even just the difference with the two children, Vanna and Amir, where like the way the soldiers treat both of them, and you even give a pause like during the story to point it out and say that the way that they would treat the refugees in the camp was so completely different from the way that they were treating Vanna, and they almost didn't really know how to interact with her because she was in the same situation as Amir, as a lot of these refugee children, but she was she was coming in with blonde hair and from the island, and so they were treating her differently. Like,
yeah, there's again the novel steals from all kinds of experiences, and that's one of the things that I remember from my childhood in Egypt and Qatar, in the Middle East, where I grew up. In Egypt, for example, there's a special police force that's called the tourist police, and that's all they do is protect tourists, because tourists are vital to the economy of Egypt. And so you get in trouble with the regular police because you're an average everyday Egyptian, that might end real badly for you. The tourists have an entirely different mode of protection, and all of that sort of boils down to this idea of you go to a different place, but by virtue of your wealth or your connections or wherever you stand in the hierarchy, you get to experience an entirely sanitized version of what that place really is. The hotels in Egypt, for example, one of the things they do is they have these fixers who, as soon as you step off the plane, will take your passport, give the guy at customs $20, and you don't have to stand in line and get the visa and get all that. Like, that's all taken care on your behalf. Whereas if you're a local, you don't do that stuff. You're in there for an hour and a half and getting hassled and whatever. It's just the whole premise is based on entirely different parallel existences. That's almost what you're paying for to be in that place. So all of this stuff takes place on an island that depends heavily on tourism. It depends heavily on that source of income. And so it's perfectly normal to them that there should be entirely different streams of existence based on wealth. That's part of the life there.
And even the way you talk about water and the ocean, and how it has, it can be so dangerous for the people as they're crossing on the boat. But then at the same time, the tourists are wanting, like, they keep commenting on the clearness of the water and how you can see down to the bottom. Like, seeing down to the bottom is important. Like, and
yeah, it's something I heard. I grew up. My father was an accountant, and he had to get the hell out of Egypt when I was just 5. And he ended up moving to this place called Qatar, which was a little peninsula sticking out of Saudi Arabia. And he worked as an accountant in the hotel there. And it was so I spent a lot of my time. It was a beachfront hotel. It was the only hotel in the country at the time. It was basically the only real hotel. And yeah, it was just, I didn't understand it. The clarity of the water was like the universal subject. People come to like tropical islands, they come to anywhere with a beach, they go on vacation. For some reason, being able to see into the water. And I thought, A, it's stuck in my head because I heard it so often, but B, like the metaphorical sense of like the safety of being able to see where your feet are landing seemed to work for the story I was trying to tell.
yeah, and that idea of safety too, like, yeah, that there was just this constant threat, like coming in from every angle in both of the stories, in both the before and after. And in the after, there was the element of the people that were involved in the situation, like, but you also had the element of like Mother Nature and like the storms and the ship rocking back and forth. But then as you get to the island, it's almost like, yeah, the island could be this place of refuge, but it's totally not. And that's more wrapped up in the people, like, and kind of the decisions that like each of the people make along the way. There, the one question that I would just personally ask, because I was wondering, like, So at one point, the main characters go into the refugee facility. And in my head, I'm like, it's like you're watching a horror movie where you're like, don't go into that house or don't go over into this place. And so they still like experience what the refugees are experiencing, but from that other side, right? Like watching from the other side of the fences. Is that something that like how did you end up writing about that? Does that come out of your like experience, your research, your journalism?
I mean, I've been to a few of those places over the 10 years that I was a journalist. And it varies wildly based on which part of the world you're in and the circumstances and sort of uh, funding is one of the things, right? Like how much money is actually going to these camps, how badly does the local government want to shut it down, all the rest of that. But one of the things that stuck out in my head was just like there's the overt cruelty, right? And there's there's a situational cruelty of looking at something that looks like a military zone, and you're like, these aren't combatants, but, you know. But one of the things that stuck out in my head was just the benign cruelty, the sort of almost passive cruelty. So there's a part in the book where the volunteer who's trying to run this camp is on the phone with the person who supplies the water and is complaining because they've used the same truck that a day earlier they brought the oil in and they haven't cleaned it out first. And so you've got what is obviously tainted water. Again, that's not a thing I made up. That was a real thing that happened at this camp for a long time. And it's just it's so passive, you know. It's like the act of violence against these people is one thing, but just the idea of like not cleaning a tank between delivering oil and delivering drinking water is so passive. I was thinking a lot about that sort of thing because it seems to fit in with the larger structure of the West's response to what you, if you want to call it, the refugee crisis, which is, yes, there's sort of an active violence of ramming these ships in the Mediterranean, trying to sink them, and so on and so forth. But the much larger violence is one of just ignoring it, not thinking about it. You look away, you let this stuff happen, so on and so forth. And I was trying my best to get at that because that to me it's so insidious. There's no consequence to it. Nobody's going to be held accountable, you know, for not caring. That's almost like the central privilege of living in this part of the world, is that there's no consequence to looking away. And anytime you write a book, you're effectively saying, regardless of subject matter, the one thing every writer is saying is don't look away. And so I was trying to sort of write against that as much as possible.
Yeah, that look, don't look away. And I felt that reading the book that there were in as a reader, like there were times when I wanted to look away, you know, and where you're getting more and more uncomfortable and you can just feel this like kind of this sense of dread just because like you don't want bad things to happen, right? And but then at the same time it's so rooted in realism and what's happening like in the real world, and what's happening in like these individual characters' experiences too. So one of the things that I noticed too was like this phrase of like let's go, let's go, let's go. Like so kind of there was an incredible sense of movement like throughout the whole book, right? But then you also have this mantra of like let's go, and then they also have that even said in different languages too throughout the book. Like how did that come into play? Like yeah.
Um, it occurred to me at some point that like I don't speak that many languages or anything like that, but I know the general gist of let's go in just about like every language I've ever experienced. And I was, you know, you used to like hello and goodbye and that sort of thing, but I was fascinated by this idea that the velocity of movement should be one of the first linguistic exports, you know, from every place. And so in Arabic, it's yalla. Yalla means let's go in Arabic. And so that shows up time and time again. And obviously, a lot of the book is about movement and the movement you undertake as a result of your own agency versus the movement that's forced on you, and where those two things intersect. You've got this, you know, half the book essentially is a migrant journey on a boat. It's these people sitting on a boat, but it's not like they have Google Maps or they have like advanced navigation. At one point, the smuggler is, you know, tells one of the passengers, "Okay, you're the captain. look at this compass, just set it to N. Just make sure this needle always hovers around N, and we're good to go. And that's the extent of the directions that these human beings are given. Um, it's I write a lot about agency. Right? I write a lot about that fundamental human desire to have some say over the things you do and the things that are done to you, and all the ways that people break down when you take that away. And to me, that's so intertwined with movement. American War was like that. American War was about the twin violences of warfare, which is the violence of forced movement and the violence of forced penning in place. Right? You're made to move when you don't want to, and you're made to stay when you don't want to. So those two things have always been intertwined to me in my head, is agency and movement. And a lot of my writing is at the intersection of those two places.
And particularly too, when you think about the boat and, the refugees coming over on the boat, and that idea of there's movement, but they're not. They're like held captive on this boat, and waiting to arrive somewhere. And that was the interesting thing too, because talking about agency and talking about how people respond to these different situations, and you had all of these characters on the boat that were responding very differently, like to particular moments, and that was when I talked about like the frustration, that was me wanting like the characters to be nicer to each other. Sorry, sometimes I'm such a mom where I'm like, come on. But it just kept happening again and again of like, you have the little elements of bureaucracy in the other pieces of the book, but then you also have these little human elements where like some people are passively cruel to each other, like in these moments after moment after moment. But then you also have this one character, I think was it Ibrahim, who a woman who like actually tries really hard to care for Amir, like, and how did that character end up developing for you? Like, what were you kind of trying to do with her?
Yeah, so a lot of the characters on the boat are, I don't steal whole people. I don't generally steal whole people, but I do steal snippets of people. And a lot of my family members and people I remember from Egypt and Qatar show up, like little traits of theirs show up in the book. And some of the arguments are arguments I've had in the past with people who, it's almost more infuriating because they're close to me, right? Is that you're sitting next to someone, you're just like, how can you hold this position? Like, how can you hold that argument? So Ibrahim, in Arabic, a lot of people end up taking sort of, it's not really a nickname, but it's sort of another name that is, it means, so means mother. And so it's mother of Ibrahim. So the other one, you see someone in there like Abu Muhammad, that means father of Muhammad. That means they have a son named Muhammad. And so she's Ibrahim. That's a common sort of way to address people in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt. And when we first meet her, she is this pregnant woman, fully veiled, and is on this boat trying to make it to the West. I mentioned earlier that I had at one point written monologues from the point of view of all the central characters on the boat, and hers was that she was married to a man who, there's a very strange thing that happens in places like Egypt, and I'm sure it happens here as well, where you have someone who's very pious, they're very dignified, they kiss their kids goodnight, and also they do some horrible stuff. So this guy was a very pious man, religious, and also worked as a torturer in the secret prisons of Egypt. There's places like Scorpion Prison, and there's a whole bunch of prisons where you get disappeared into and nobody ever hears from you again. And so she was escaping that. But when we first meet her, she's sitting there and she's reading this thing phonetically. She has this piece of paper and she's reading this thing. She's trying to learn the English syllables for hello, I am pregnant. I will have baby on April 28th, whatever it was. I need hospital, please help. And she's sitting there and she's trying to read it. And a lot of that comes from my experiences with there's certain things about your identity that you can't really change. I've been a Muslim for as long as I can remember. My skin color is what it is. My ethnicity is what it is. But if I called you up on the phone and said, my name's John Smith, you'd probably believe me, right? I've been working a long time on this accent. And whenever I'm crossing borders into this part of the world in particular, the difference with which I am treated relative to my cousins who have the same names, look the same, but don't have this accent is like night and day. And so she's desperately trying to change the thing she can change. And I mean, I grew up around people like that. It's when you're trying to make it out to this part of the world, it's almost part and parcel of it. I mean, the reason I sound the way I do is because I come from a generation, the generation before me, as a result of the British and the French showing up to Egypt and basically running the place for a long time. That generation came to believe that English, French, those were the winners' languages. And if you wanted your kid to get ahead in life, you had no choice. And so that's why I sound the way I do. And for a long time, I was really proud of that. I thought, look at me, look what I've accomplished. And it's only in recent years that I started thinking about the negative space of that, how little I know about my own culture, how bad my Arabic is, and so she's in the place where she's trying to change what she can change about herself preemptively, because she knows it's going to make a huge difference in her, not just her life, but in the life of this child she's about to have.
Yeah, and it's also wrapped in that discussion too that you were talking about of naming too. And thanks for the explanation of the name too, because that made her character make a lot more sense to me also. Like, but they talk about names and, if you should be Muhammad or if you should change your name to something else, because how are you going to be perceived like at the border? And then they talk about all the names that they're going to try. Like, I'm going to be Sylvia, or I'm going to be this and that. Like, yeah, that idea of like identity being so important, but you're not determining like how people perceive you, like, and they're trying to do that, like, and is that something that you've seen like as you've done all of your traveling, like with journalism and as people deal with identity and crossing borders and
Yeah, I mean, so in that scene where I think it's the smuggler's apprentice on the boat who's saying like, pick a saint, pick a Michael, a Peter, or what. So those 5 names that he says are the names of the 5 boys that Peter Pan, the original Peter Pan, was based on. So J.M. Barrie was friends with this woman named Sylvia who had 5 kids, and he took pieces of their personalities and made Peter Pan out of it. And so it's actually it's the entire biography of J.M. Barrie is really sad and really fascinating at the same time. But because one of those kids was named Peter, for the rest of that kid's life, every time he would the press assumed that he was Peter Pan. And for the rest of his life, anything he did, there would be a news story saying, Peter Pan boy does this. He tried to start up his own publishing agency, like his own publishing house. And it would be like, Peter Pan boy starts, and it eventually drove him. I mean, he killed himself. He ended up, it hounded him for the rest of his life. It's the most famous children's character on earth at the time, basically the shadow of that followed him around. Yeah, names play a big part in the book. Amir goes by a bunch, he goes by David for a while. But that thing about Ibrahim and sort of clarifying the what that means, this book has a very, like I said, it steals from a lot of different lineages, and that results in certain scenes and certain sort of moments in the book that are really like, it's unreasonable for me to expect people to get what the hell is happening. So like the prime example is at the beginning of the book, Vanna is really upset because the nightclub down by the beach is playing this rap song. She can't stand it, and they're playing it over and over again. And it's never sort of explicitly stated, but if you read between the lines, the song is Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z. You fast forward to the, a few chapters ahead, the migrant boat is showing up, and they hear sounds in the distance. And one of the characters says, hey, they're playing our music. They're playing Khusara Khusara. So Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z samples a mid-20th century Egyptian pop song called Khusara Khusara. The Venn diagram of people whose cultural knowledge includes the music of Jay-Z and also mid-20th century. It's me and like 2 other people, right? And so there's a lot of that stuff in the book. I had to make a conscious decision at some point, particularly among sort of Muslim writers, brown writers. We always have these conversations about where you stand on the spectrum of overtness. So on one end of the spectrum, I know writers who, if they have a single Arabic word, it'll be in italics and they'll explain it right away. Inshallah, he said, meaning God willing, which is a phrase that uses. And then on the other end of the spectrum are people like me who are just like, nope, we're gonna, and you have to make a decision at some point because you're actively going to lose readers, and it's not their fault. I've read a lot of literature from this part of the world that assumes I know things about the Bible and Shakespeare that I didn't know. But you have to make those decisions. And so for this novel in particular, even more so than American War, which was already sort of on the edge of that spectrum, this one very much like whatever's below the surface is going to stay below the surface, at the expense of whatever it costs me to do that. It had to be that way for this particular story I was trying to tell. So yeah, it's just full of little things like that make no sense otherwise.
They're little Easter eggs if you know, right? And then they add depth and texture to the story for people who recognize those little bits.
Yeah, you always hope that you're going to be read like Ulysses. There's going to be academics who are just going to be sort of highlighting every word.
Annotations.
For years. And that never happens. It's never. But it's fun to pretend.
It was, the funny part was, talking about reading like an academic. I read the two pieces in the foreword that were about Peter Pan and about the Oxbow incident, and I was like, oh man, because if you know the Oxbow incident, I just kept expecting it to go somewhere, so I'm not going to plot spoil that, but kind of plot spoiled it.
It's a book that spoils itself from the first page and then keeps spoiling for like a while.
Yeah, and that's the thing, it just keeps building on it, so you keep expecting things to happen and then things you don't expect happen. So you have these parable elements, right, where it reads like a classic experience of someone. So you can look at this person and you can have your very narrow view of them and think of them as somebody who's going through a story, like a character moving through a story. But then both the things that happen to them and the way that they react to those things is what makes it an amazing book, because the little twists and turns that lead to the interactions that happen kept surprising me and kept me reading. So, and the other thing that I haven't said yet is also there are some really funny parts and there are some great parts where the two kids are interacting and they're finding the things that they share in common, so their little commonalities. And one of the things is these little books, and they're reading through the books and they're trying to learn from each other, and so there's a book that you you were referencing throughout, just a little comic. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's I sort of plagiarized it, but then I changed it completely, which was a weird combination of things. So there is actually a comic strip in Syria. It's called Zaytun and Zaytuna, it popped up in the research I was doing, but the version that's presented in the book I changed around completely. I was thinking a little bit about this. There's a line. So Amir is a big fan of these comic books, and there's a line about, it's these two kids, Zaytuna and Zaytuna. So Zaytun is Arabic for olive, and Zaytuna is what you would take if you took everything is masculine and feminine in Arabic. So table would be tarabeza, it's masculine, feminine. And so if you took the word olive, which is masculine, and you feminized it, you would get Zaytuna. So those are the two characters, olive and olive. And the thing that, they go and have their adventures and they do all of that stuff. But the thing that fascinates Amir about the whole setup, the thing he's in love with, is this notion that no matter what happens, no matter what absurdity takes place in the story, everything's reset at the beginning of the next comic, And so this idea that you can go back in time to the starting point, no matter what you get yourself into, which is subconsciously every piece of serial entertainment on TV, every sitcom I've ever watched, no matter what the hell happens, every episode of The Simpsons, you go back to that starting point. And given the things he experiences in his youth, it's not the contraptions, it's not the adventures, it's not whatever that fascinates him. It's this idea that you can go back to the start over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen that change so much. Like, yeah, that episodic television idea of like, things start one way and wild things happen, but in the end, it's going to be back at the same exact point.
It's super comforting, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just a comforting thing to know.
Yeah, I think even taking a 4 second sidetrack, like WandaVision, for example, like is one that plays with that. Like you start
Yeah.
out with this idea of like, oh, this is the way that like the Dick Van Dyke Show is. Oh, but it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the so thinking about yeah, what do you have next? What's in the pipeline? What are you working on? What can you talk about?
I have one paragraph of the new novel. It's not good. So 100% of the manuscript has to be edited right now. 100% of the manuscript has to go. Um, I I have a couple of short stories coming out, including one very, very ill-advised return to my comedy writing roots. I used to write comedy a million years ago, and it'll come to a surprise to anyone who's read my super depressing novels. But I used to write comedy, and I wrote this short story that was, I didn't know it was going to be in an anthology. It was for this thing called Selected Shorts out in New York, where every year they go and read, you write a story and then they have professional actors read it to an audience, like a live stage audience. So I wrote this comedy about, in the form of pandemic commercials. I wrote this thing at the beginning of the pandemic, and super absurdist, silly, whatever. And then it kept getting pushed back because of the performance couldn't happen because of the pandemic. So now it's been pushed to spring of 2022. So these jokes about the pandemic that were dated about a week after I wrote them are now going to be told to a live audience 2 years after I wrote them. And if I had much of a career, I would say it's going to be career ruining. But then they also decided to publish this thing in an anthology. And I recently got the ARC, I recently got the advanced copy. And it's just this incredible list of like MacArthur Grant winners and Pulitzer. And I'm at the very bottom, and there's all these serious stories. And then there's my thing sticking out like a sore thumb. So all of this comes to a head in the spring of next year. I also wrote the introduction to a new translation of Arabian Nights, which is the first time it's been translated by an Arab woman, and it's just a ridiculously gorgeous book. It has tons of new revelations about the authorship of these old, very old stories. Just amazing imagery. I did the least amount of work of anyone involved in that project, but I take full credit for it anyway because it's a gorgeous piece of work. And beyond that, just like taking a little bit of time to try and refresh after it's been a long launch cycle for this book, because it bled into the American launch, bled into the Canadian, into a bunch of work stuff. So some downtime, and then attack this novel, of which I have a sole paragraph so far.
But I know that you get no real downtime because you're in Toronto, and then aren't you also at the Portland Book Festival next week too?
Yeah, it's weird. After 18 months of not doing any in-person stuff, I did the Vancouver Writers Festival up in BC, which was my first in person. It was like weirdly emotional to be in front of people again. And at one point I got a tickle in my throat and I was about to cough, and I instinctively reached for a non-existent mouse to hit the mute button. Like I sort of built that reflex in my head from so many Zoom events. And then this Toronto stuff is all in person as well. And then Portland Book Festival's in person. So after 18 months of none of it, I suddenly have
All of it.
jump back in the deep end. Yeah.
Well, while we have a few minutes, we do have a question from the audience. Someone is asking, do you consider Muhammad a villain?
It's a really good question. Yes, it's a short answer. But my villains, I mean, the villains of my stories stay in my head much more so than almost any other character. I think part of this has to do with just an identity thing, I guess. So I'm a Muslim brown guy living in the US. When I think of like popular cultural depictions of people who are like me, particularly out of somewhere like Hollywood, you fall into one of three categories, right? You're either the bad guy who's a terrorist, you're the good guy who helps Jack Bauer catch the terrorist, or you're a fruit and vegetable vendor whose stall gets destroyed in a Matt Damon car chase. Like that's the entirety of the existence, right? And so when you're writing characters with that in mind, there's almost a knee-jerk reaction to be like, all this systemic stereotyping of my people, I'm going to offset it by having all my characters be pure as the driven snow. And single-handedly, I'm going to offset all the damage that has been done. And of course, that's garbage. That doesn't make any sense. I love writing villains. I love writing complex villains. And one of the things that my villains have in common is that they might lie to everybody else, but they're very honest with themselves. And Muhammad's that guy. You know, he's my Captain Hook on the boat, and then Colonel Kethros is my Captain Hook on the land. And he's one of those people who has a very tortured relationship with what the West represents, because on one hand, his livelihood depends on it. You know, he's a smuggler's apprentice, and he hopes to be a smuggler one day. He hopes to ferry people over and make money that way. But then on the other hand, he knows what's likely waiting for them on the other side. All the bureaucracy, all of the expectation to be eternally grateful and to do the menial labor and to constantly occupy the lowest possible strata of society and be happy to do it. And so he's living with these contradictions of what this place is. And he more than anyone else on the boat is based on people I know who have that kind of relationship with the West, which is like, that place is awful. It's full of racists. At one point, there's that line about, like, you know, somebody calls him a black market hustler, and he says, "You think the black market is bad? Wait till you see the white market," and you know, that kind of thing. But also, if you offered me a green card, I'd be there tomorrow. You know, and so he sticks out in my head because he reminds me of a lot of people I know. Obviously, not in that extreme a situation of the kind of work they do, but yes, I do think he's a villain, but he's a villain who's very close to me.
So Emily had this. She said, loved your book and this conversation. So thank you for that, Emily. Could you say a little more about the genesis of the title?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So What Strange Paradise is a line from a poem by Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus was a poet who was active about 100 years ago. She was, her most famous poem is The New Colossus, which is the thing that's etched into the Statue of Liberty. You know, bring me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. This is from another one of her poems, much lesser known, actually not nearly as good as a lot of her other work, but it was a line that stuck out to me. One of the things about Emma Lazarus is that she was very much concerned with the plight of Eastern European Jews who are being subjected to horrible persecution. Obviously a prelude to a much worse persecution during the middle of the century, but and she wrote a lot about the movement to get away, to get the hell out. And then you end up in a place like Western Europe, where suddenly you find that you're subject to an entirely different kind of persecution. She has this incredible poem. One of her poems is about two Eastern European Jews who end up fleeing all the way to rural Texas. And so they're sitting around in Texas, and the gist of the poem is these two people saying, "Thank God, we made it, we're safe. What the hell is this place? Like, we have no cultural markers, we know nothing about the, you know, like the." And so What Strange Paradise, in addition to having a lot to do with the structure of the novel, and you know, for the same reason that Vanna's last name is Hermes, and what Hermes isn't, you know, also that idea of like, we got to safety, now what, kind of permeates the book. So it comes from an Emma Lazarus poem.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Well, as we get close to wrapping up, if anyone has any additional questions, please pop them into the chat or the Q&A. And I do want to remind everyone that our other two bookstores that were part of this event, which is Dudley's Bookshop in downtown Bend off of Minnesota, which is open every day, as well as Paulina Springs Books out in Sisters. Please visit both of those stores if you are close to them. Obviously, please come see us at Roundabout as well. We love supporting our fellow indie bookstores, as well as you know, indie authors and best-selling authors, both of you. And if you have or if you haven't picked up either of Omar's books, please do that from any independent bookstore. And the same with Kate's. We would be happy to order in any of her books for your purchasing pleasure. And we're always excited to suggest new books to people. So if you have one where you say, I read this and I loved it, what's the next one? That's what we are here for. I always like to ask this question, and obviously I maybe could have told you both this, but please give our audience one must-read book that you've recently read, say in the last year. Kate, do you want to go first?
I'm totally cheating because I get to look at my bookcase over there. I've read a lot of books recently. I would say besides Omar's, I tend to read a lot of sci-fi fantasy. So I recently read like Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey, and the Scholomance series by Naomi, fill in her last name because I don't remember. but weirdly, they're both kind of Harry Potter type of stories. They're magic schools where, like, the kids don't, the magic schools aren't good and the people aren't good. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting, if you grew up in this world of Harry Potter, what would magic schools really be like? And what would kids be like if they were really in magic schools? So those are two strangely connected books that I've read recently.
Excellent. Okay, we'll have to look those up. Omar, do you have a book rec?
Yeah, sure. Let's do one nonfiction, one fiction. The last nonfiction book I read that I really liked was Wildland by Evan Osnos. So I think the subheading of Wildland is like the making of America's fury or rage or something like that. It's a book where he tries to figure out how it got to where it is, how the country got to be as polarized and sort of antagonistic to itself as it is. But he does it through visiting 3 towns with which he has a personal connection. So there's Chicago, Illinois. There's Greenwich, Connecticut, which is like the hedge fund capital of America. That's where all these ludicrously rich hedge fund types live behind these giant walls in their mansions. And then what is it? Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is one of those towns that used to be a big mining town, and now sort of everything's falling apart. It's a really fascinating look at all of the different forces that got us to the place where we are. And it's full of incredible little statistics that all sound deranged. Like I can't believe that a country would produce this kind of statistic. And also these little anecdotes, like the CFO magazine, which I didn't know was a thing, but there's CFO magazine has an award of excellence that they give out to, I guess, the most excellent CFO in the country. And they had to shut it down because the last 3 people to win it ended up in jail. They ended up being convicted of like various corporate crimes. So they very quietly shut down their award of excellence. It's a really, really fascinating book. And then there was a novel that I read. I actually just reread Michael Ondaatje's Coming Through Slaughter, which is just line for line, like one of the most gorgeous books. It's a book about jazz, I guess, but you just read it for the line level beauty. That's from a long time ago, but it's one of those books. I just reread it thinking that it might have less power now that I'm old. Nope, it's fantastic. A new one is Here is a Body by Basma Abdelaziz, an Egyptian writer, who her writing has gotten her into a lot of trouble. The cops in Egypt keep going and taking her books off the shelves. This is a novel based on a massacre that happened in Egypt a few years ago, this thing called the Roundabout massacre, where the cops came in and killed upwards of 1,000 people in a day. And she's written about this in a fictional sort of way, but very dangerous novel. Like, I don't think she can continue to live in Egypt now. Excellent translation, really good book. I would highly recommend it.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So thank you again, everyone, for being here tonight. If you know someone who would be interested in this book or any of the other events that we've had recently, please do direct them to our YouTube channel so that they can watch these events and learn about new books. And again, I want to thank our partners at Dudley's and Paulina Springs and everyone who was here. Again, thank you to both of you, Omar and Kate, for taking the time to chat with us about these books, and for supporting independent bookstores like I know you both do. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for that. So I think we'll sign off on that, wishing you both happy holidays if I don't see or talk to you, and everyone who's watching, and happy reading.
Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you.
Bye.